The silence in the auditorium was not ordinary. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it chokes it. No one spoke, no one even shifted in their seats. All eyes were on the small figure standing in the spotlight. A girl, barely 5 years old, wrapped in white, her clear eyes glowing under the harsh lights. Just moments ago, an entire audience had laughed when she asked to speak. But now, they couldn't look away. And neither could he. Father Leonard, a man who had spent his life silencing others, was now frozen in place. But this story didn't begin with her words. It started much earlier, in a city in Eastern Europe, known for its grand cathedrals, strict traditions, and a growing discomfort with outsiders. There, in a church made of stone and pride, stood one of the most revered men in the region, Father Leonard Gray. A man praised not only for his sermons but for his unmatched ability to debate. His followers called him a lion of truth. His opponents called him dangerous. And both were correct. Father Leonard wasn't just a priest, he was a scholar. With degrees from Rome and accolades from Europe's top theological institutes, he had built his reputation as a man who dissected faith with surgical precision. Especially Islam. He had studied it for years, not to understand it, but to dismantle it. In open debates, he picked apart religious texts, tore through arguments, and left Muslim scholars speechless and ridiculed. People flocked to see him not to learn, but to watch him win. His words were like weapons, sharp, practiced, relentless. Whenever a young debater dared to confront him, they were met with philosophical traps and mocking applause from a crowd eager for blood. Yet Leonard remained calm through it all. To him, it was a game. A righteous one. Then came the announcement that would change everything. One bright morning, the city's main cathedral released a statement that Father Leonard would host a special open debate. The topic: Who is the true God? It was to be the biggest event of the year, live-streamed across all major platforms, held in the central church that could seat over 2,000 people. The invitation was open. Adults, youth, and shockingly, even children, were welcome to attend and ask questions. To most, this sounded like a publicity stunt. To Leonard, it was a challenge to fate. And somewhere, in a modest corner of the same city, a quiet ripple began to stir. A few miles from the grandeur of the cathedral, in a compact apartment above an electronics repair shop, lived a small immigrant family. The father, Yusuf, fixed old radios and phones for a living. The mother, Miriam, offered private religious lessons to local immigrant children. Life wasn't easy, but it was full of love, discipline, and silence filled with meaning. In the middle of this humble family was a child who didn't quite belong to this world, at least not entirely. Her name was Aliyah. Just 5 years old, she was unlike other children. While others played with dolls or clutched tablets, she spent her evenings beside her mother listening to stories of ancient wisdom. She rarely demanded attention, yet she carried an invisible gravity that pulled hearts toward her. Her father often found her quietly standing by the window before dawn, whispering into the stillness. And when she smiled, it wasn't the carefree grin of a child, it was something deeper. As if she knew something the rest of the world had forgotten. 2 days before the scheduled debate, Yusuf's old friend Karim came to visit. A university student and a passionate lover of philosophy, Karim was eager to witness Leonard in person. He had long admired debaters, but never had the chance to attend one this big. "Come with me," he urged Yusuf. "This isn't just a debate. It's going to be a war of minds. We should see it for ourselves." Yusuf hesitated. The idea of stepping into a massive church hall, surrounded by thousands, felt overwhelming. But Karim's energy was hard to resist. Just as they agreed to go, a small voice spoke up. "Can I come too?" Aliyah stood near the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. She had been listening the whole time. Yusuf blinked. "Aliyah, sweetheart, this is not a place for children. It's going to be loud, complicated. I won't speak," she said gently. I just want to listen. Yusuf looked at her for a long moment. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them. Calm. Certain. And for some reason, his heart, usually cautious and logical, found peace in her gaze. He nodded. The day of the debate arrived like a storm. The church was a beast of a building, high arches, glass stained with centuries of devotion, and a stage wide enough to host a choir. Crowds surged through the doors. Cameras hovered in the air. Broadcasters murmured behind microphones. Seats filled quickly, the air thick with anticipation. And at the center of it all stood Leonard. Tall, refined, clothed in ceremonial robes that seemed to shimmer under the lights. He welcomed the audience with charm, laced with veiled superiority. Today, he announced, we will not insult each other's faiths. We will challenge them. The audience applauded. He invited questions. One by one, brave souls stepped forward. Some were students. Others were Muslim community leaders. Each offered questions, arguments, and references. And one by one, Leonard dissected them. His responses were eloquent. His counter-questions sharper than the originals. The crowd clapped, smiled, laughed. And then, a small voice cut through the noise. May I speak, sir? Silence fell. Heads turned. From the far end of the room, a small hand rose. The voice didn't waver. It didn't shout. But it reached everyone. A murmur spread. Some chuckled. Some frowned. And Leonard, intrigued, peered into the crowd. You, he said. A little girl? Aliyah stepped forward. Wearing a plain white dress, her hijab neatly pinned, eyes glowing with something none could name. She walked slowly, as if each step carried weight beyond her years. As if the floor itself adjusted beneath her. Leonard gestured. Let her come, he said with a grin. Maybe we'll learn something new. Mocking laughter followed. But Aliyah didn't flinch. She walked straight to the center, stood before the towering figure of Leonard, and waited. So tell us, he asked, arms crossed. Who is God, little one? She looked up, eyes steady. And then she spoke. God is not something you prove, she said softly. He is something you feel, when you are alone, and the world goes quiet, and you realize you are being watched, not by people, but by something that knows you better than yourself. A hush fell. Leonard blinked. The crowd stared. And for the first time in a long, long time, the master of debate didn't know what to say. The silence that followed Aliyah's words wasn't like the one before. This one wasn't respectful, it was sacred. It wrapped itself around the congregation, tightening like a quiet storm. Leonard's lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. For years, he had faced questions from scholars, skeptics, and believers alike. But never had a child, let alone one so young, shattered the confidence he wore like armor. He cleared his throat, forcing himself back into role. What exactly do you mean? He asked, voice slightly strained. You say God is not proven, but felt. But can feelings be trusted, little one? Aliyah didn't answer immediately. She looked down for a moment, her tiny fingers curling together in thought. Then she raised her head again and said, Have you ever cried without knowing why? Leonard blinked. Aliyah continued, Have you ever been completely alone, yet felt that someone was with you, watching, not to judge, but to hold you together when you were about to fall apart? The room seemed to hold its breath. That feeling, she said, is not imagination. It's not comfort. It's recognition. It's the part of you that still remembers where it came from. There was no applause. No laughter. Just the haunting sound of stillness. Leonard's smile faded slightly. But isn't it dangerous to build faith on emotion alone? Isn't that how people fall into illusions? Don't we need reason to guide us? Aliyah nodded gently. Yes. Reason helps you walk, But the path itself is made of truth, not theories. And truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, until your noise is gone. A woman in the second row gasped softly, covering her mouth with trembling hands. A man further back lowered his head, blinking rapidly. Leonard's fingers tapped the edge of his podium. His posture shifted. The towering confidence he once had now looked slightly tilted. "You speak of silence as if it's a voice," he said, grasping for control. "But silence can be empty, too. Silence can be loneliness. Only when your heart is closed," Aliyah replied. Another murmur moved through the crowd, this one not mocking, but stunned. Leonard stepped back slightly. He wasn't used to this. Not just being challenged, but being disarmed. He was a master at taking apart arguments. But this wasn't an argument. This was something else. It wasn't logic. It was truth spoken in the language of the soul. "And how do you know you're right?" he asked, his tone no longer theatrical but almost pleading. "You're just a child." Aliyah looked at him with something between sadness and strength. "Because when I put my forehead on the ground at night, I don't feel alone. I feel watched, protected, and loved by something that asks for nothing but my heart." A sound came from somewhere near the front. A sob. Someone tried to stifle it, but it echoed anyway. Then another. And another. Eyes that had come to witness a debate were now filled with tears. Leonard swallowed hard. "And if someone told you that's just your imagination?" Aliyah tilted her head slightly. "Then I would tell them that some truths are too big for imagination. That's why children feel them before adults do. Because we don't cover it up with questions." Suddenly, Leonard's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the edge of the podium to steady himself. No one laughed. No one cheered. Not even his followers. Because no one could anymore. He stepped down from the stage. The cameras tried to follow, but none dared get too close. He walked toward the center of the church, stopping a few feet in front of her. Aliyah didn't move. Leonard looked down. His face was pale. His lips trembled. "I don't know what this is," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "But I feel like I've been asleep my whole life." Aliyah said nothing. And then, he fell. Not fainting. Not collapsing. He slowly, deliberately dropped to his knees. And with a motion that made the entire church feel like it had stopped breathing, he bowed his head to the ground. It was not a gesture of defeat. It was surrender. A former priest. A man known for destroying belief. Now kneeling in front of a 5-year-old girl, not for her, but for the light that radiated from the stillness she carried with her. The reaction was unlike anything the world had expected. At first, the audience simply watched stunned. The clapping never came. Instead, what followed was silence. Profound and heavy. Then slowly, people began to rise, not to leave, but to cry. A woman in the front row wept openly into her husband's coat. A teenager who had come as a joke now sat holding his face in his hands. A journalist in the back whispered into her mic, "I don't know how to report this. I think I just saw something divine." And Aliyah remained where she stood. Quiet. Still. Watching Leonard tremble on the ground like a man who had just awakened in a world he never believed in. Moments later, she stepped toward him. Just 2 small steps. She placed one hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up, face soaked, breath shaky. She said only one thing. "Sometimes the smallest hands carry the heaviest truths." He nodded, tears falling freely now. The cameras captured every moment. And within minutes, that footage spread across the globe like wildfire. But the story was only beginning. That night, headlines broke all over the world. Renowned priest falls to his knees after child speaks about God. 5-year-old girl silences a scholar with words of the heart. Is this the face of a spiritual awakening? Social media exploded. Some praised the event as a miracle. Others accused it of being staged. Analysts debated the theology. Skeptics dissected the psychology. But none could deny one thing: the sincerity in Leonard's collapse. It was too raw, too real to be rehearsed. But as the light began to spread, the shadows grew restless. That very night, in a private meeting room not far from the city center, a powerful man named Marcus Helsdorf sat watching the footage again and again. His fists clenched. His eyes narrowed. He was no priest. He was no believer either. Marcus was the head of a powerful organization that had long opposed religious integration, especially the kind that threatened cultural dominance. He had seen movements like this before. He had seen emotions spark revolutions. And he had crushed them. "This child," he muttered, "this moment is dangerous." One of his advisors, seated beside him, leaned forward. "Sir, it's just a girl." Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "No," he snapped. "It's never just a girl. It's an idea. And ideas don't need guns to win. They need hearts. And that's what she's starting to touch." Outside, the world was still trying to understand what had happened. In a quiet apartment, Aaliyah sat on her mother's lap, unaware of the storm that was brewing. She held a cup of warm milk in her hands and leaned her head gently on her mother's shoulder. Yusuf sat nearby, still too stunned to speak. Miriam brushed Aaliyah's hair softly and asked, "Are you all right?" Aaliyah nodded slowly. "I didn't do anything special." Miriam kissed the top of her daughter's head. "You just did what most of us forget to do," she whispered. "You told the truth. But truth has a price. And soon the door would knock. And everything would begin to change." By morning, the world was on fire with questions. News anchors replayed the footage on loop. Analysts discussed the implications of a child shaking the foundations of a prominent theologian's beliefs. Millions of viewers, believers and skeptics alike, flocked to online platforms to witness the moment for themselves. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had an explanation. Yet in a modest apartment nestled between old shops and narrow roads, life was trying to remain normal. Aaliyah's family woke to a different kind of mourning. The street outside was no longer quiet. Journalists, photographers, and strangers lingered nearby. Some came with curiosity. Some came with suspicion. And some just came to stare at the child who had silenced the storm. Inside, Yusuf paced the small living room. He peeked through the curtain and saw 3 men with large cameras standing across the street. Miriam sat at the table, silently reading a message from a local community member. It read, "Be careful. They're going to try to make you the problem." Aaliyah, meanwhile, sat quietly in a corner with her sketchbook, drawing what looked like a star above a small hill. Her world hadn't changed. But the world outside her had. Then came the knock. Kareem, the university student who had taken Yusuf and Aaliyah to the debate, opened the door. Standing there was a man in a tailored suit, a press badge around his neck. "I'm sorry to barge in," the man said. "But I'd like to speak with Aaliyah. Just a few questions." Yusuf stepped forward. "She's 5, he said flatly. "I know, sir. But she's become a symbol. People need to hear from her." Kareem's voice was firm. "People don't need to feed on her. This is not your story. Let her be a child." The journalist backed away, hands raised in mock surrender. But as he left, he turned and said under his breath, "That kind of light always attracts darkness." Yusuf closed the door slowly. Then he locked it. That evening, a new headline spread through news channels. Authorities investigate foreign influence in debate incident. Aaliyah's name was mentioned indirectly. But the implication was clear. Some claimed she had been coached. Others went further, suggesting the event was a religious stunt, orchestrated by extremist networks. Suddenly, Aaliyah was no longer just a child. She was becoming a threat, to some. And behind it all was Marcus Helstorff. From a tall building surrounded by metal and marble, Marcus watched the narrative unfold. It was exactly what he had predicted. But it wasn't moving fast enough. He gathered his advisory council, men in suits with ties that cost more than most people earned in a week. "We cannot allow sentiment to override structure," Marcus said. "This story has spread too far. If we don't seize control of the narrative now, it will become unstoppable." One of the advisors asked, "What exactly do you propose?" "Pressure," Marcus said coldly. "Discredit the family. Connect them to foreign agendas. Make them the enemy of peace." Across town, Yusuf was already feeling the weight of it. That afternoon, his boss at the electronics shop called and told him not to return. No explanation. No severance. Just silence. Miriam was followed on her way home from the market. A black car lingered behind her for 3 blocks. Its windows were tinted. Its driver never looked away. Even Aliyah noticed the shift. Her once friendly neighbors now crossed the street to avoid them. Smiles turned to stares. Whispers filled the air. But she never complained. That night, as the house finally grew quiet, Yusuf sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall on the cobblestone street. His heart was heavy with questions he couldn't ask aloud. Aliyah came and sat beside him, her tiny feet dangling off the edge of the chair. "Are you sad, Abi?" she asked. Yusuf smiled weakly. "Just thinking." She looked up at him. "About the people outside?" "Yes." She nodded as if she understood something bigger than her years. Then she said quietly, "Sometimes people don't get angry because they hate the truth, but because it makes them feel small." Yusuf looked at her in awe. "Where do you learn these things?" She leaned her head against his arm. "From you and Mama. From silence. And from the stars." He hugged her tightly. But as he held her, he knew in his bones that something bigger was coming. Something they weren't ready for. The next morning brought the worst blow yet. A government official arrived at their door. She was polite but cold. Dressed in gray. Clipboard in hand. "I'm here to conduct an assessment regarding your legal status in the country," she said. "There have been complaints." Yusuf's heart sank. What kind of complaints? The woman didn't answer directly. She began inspecting their home, asking about income, residency, and religious instruction. She noted Aliyah's books, her drawings, even the prayer mat in the corner. When she left, she handed Yusuf a document. It read, "Notice of Review, Immigration and National Security Status." Kareem crumpled the paper in his fist the moment he saw it. "This is political. They're trying to deport you." Yusuf said nothing. Miriam sat down, breathing hard, her eyes darting between her daughter and the paper. Aliyah, standing near the window, whispered, "It's okay." "No, sweetheart," Miriam said, trembling. "It's not." But Aliyah looked back and replied, "Then maybe, it's just beginning." Meanwhile, in a quiet rural home far from the city, a man sat alone in a dimly lit room, writing in a journal. It was Leonard. Since that night in the church, he had been placed on temporary leave from all official religious duties. His social media accounts were disabled. His phone calls monitored. Even his old friends in the clergy had begun to distance themselves. But none of it mattered. Because in his journal, Leonard was recording something no institution could silence. "For years, I thought truth came from books. But a child taught me it comes from the space between words." He hadn't spoken to Aliyah's family since the incident. Not out of fear, but out of caution, for them. He knew how fragile the moment was, and how vicious the opposition could be. But as he watched the news unfold, the weight of his silence became unbearable. So that night, he made a decision. He packed a bag, wrote a note to the only friend he still trusted, and walked out into the darkness. The light he had seen that day had not dimmed. But it needed protection. And he was ready to protect it, even if the world turned against him. The air was heavy with unease. Inside the small apartment, the family sat around the table, the notice of review lying in the center like a bomb that hadn't yet exploded. No one dared to touch it. Miriam clutched her scarf with trembling fingers. Kareem paced the room like a caged animal. Yusuf stared blankly at the paper. Only Aliyah remained still, quietly sipping warm tea as if preparing for a storm she already knew was coming. Outside, the buzz of cameras had faded. But not because the media lost interest, because they had moved into strategy. The story had changed from wonder to warning. Commentators began asking dangerous questions. Was this child coached? Is this an attempt to infiltrate traditional faith? Is Western society under spiritual attack from within? The questions were rhetorical. The intent wasn't to seek answers, but to plant fear. And somewhere in the city, the man behind that fear was preparing for the final strike. Marcus Helsdorf stood before a projection screen in a dim-lit conference room, flanked by political consultants and media analysts. Footage of Aliyah's speech looped silently behind him. "We've underestimated this situation," he said, his voice calm but venomous. "The emotional impact of this moment has become a global trigger." A consultant raised a hand. "But if we push too hard, sir, it could backfire. People are sympathizing with the girl." "Then we change the emotion," Marcus said coldly. "We pivot from awe to doubt. From compassion to fear. We make them believe she's not a symbol of truth, but a symbol of danger." He pointed to the headline drafts on the screen. "Family under investigation for ties to foreign doctrines. Child's claims spark national security debate. Is this innocence or indoctrination?" Marcus looked around the room. "If we don't control the narrative, it will control us." Meanwhile, Leonard was already on the move. Having left the rural refuge of Father Johann's home, he made his way toward the city with a single goal: to find Aliyah and her family. He had tried to stay away, hoping his silence would protect them. But now, silence was no longer neutral, it was complicity. On the way, he avoided main roads and public places. His face had become too recognizable. Anonymous online forums had begun circulating conspiracy theories about him, some even calling him possessed or converted by sorcery. The irony stung. He, a man of reason, now accused of losing his mind because he had listened to the heart of a child. When he finally arrived at the outskirts of the city, Leonard looked like a different man. His clothes were worn, his face unshaven, his eyes tired, but within them burned a light that had not dimmed. He walked quietly through back alleys, avoiding checkpoints, until he reached the small building he had memorized from online images. It was Yusuf's home. He knocked twice. Yusuf opened the door slowly, expecting another official or journalist. Instead, he saw Leonard, dust-covered, weather-beaten, but unmistakably sincere. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," Leonard said softly. Yusuf didn't say a word. He simply reached out and pulled him into a hug. Inside, the reunion was quiet and full of unspoken relief. Miriam offered tea. Aliyah smiled slightly when she saw Leonard and said, "You came." "I had to," he replied. "You brought me back to life. Now it's my turn to protect yours." Kareem closed the curtains tightly and turned off the front lights. "You being here is dangerous," he said. "I know," Leonard replied. "But so is silence." As the night deepened, Leonard explained what he had seen behind the scenes, how the media was being weaponized, how Marcus was pulling strings, and how legal pressure was only the first move. "They'll go further," Leonard warned. "They'll try to break you down so slowly you won't even realize you've changed, until the light inside you is dimmed." Miriam looked at her daughter. "Then what should we do?" Leonard leaned forward. "We don't just defend ourselves. We remind people what they saw, what they felt. That moment in the church wasn't just spiritual, it was real. And truth doesn't need to shout, but it does need to be remembered. A plan began to form. Meanwhile, the city prepared for something entirely different. An emergency press conference was scheduled by Marcus Helsdorf. He would present new evidence, tying Ilia's family to unnamed foreign entities. He would push for immediate deportation proceedings. And he would dare the public to protest, knowing full well that fear had already taken root. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. In dozens of cities across the country, people began gathering silently in parks, outside government buildings, and near churches, holding signs that read, "Let the child be heard. Truth is not a threat. We remember the silence." Leonard had sent a single message to a trusted group of former students and clergy. "Tell the world what you felt that day, not what you were told to think." And it worked. Video clips of the moment Ilia spoke, uncut, untouched, began trending again. This time, not as a spectacle, but as a memory. People rewatched the way Leonard's expression changed. The sincerity in Ilia's voice. The crowd's silence. The tears. And they began to ask themselves, if this was a performance, why did it feel so real? Marcus's press conference still happened. He stood before cameras, speaking in grave tones about national integrity and security risks. But halfway through, a journalist raised her hand. "Sir," she asked, "do you have any actual evidence against this family? Or are you just afraid of the impact they've had?" Marcus didn't answer. Instead, his face tightened. And for the first time, cracks began to show in his confidence. Back at Yusuf's apartment, the family huddled around a small TV screen, watching the shift unfold in real time. People were no longer just reacting, they were remembering. Alia, sitting quietly beside her mother, whispered, "The heart doesn't forget truth, even when it's scared." Leonard looked at her and smiled. "Then maybe we still have a chance." But the battle wasn't over. Later that night, an envelope was slipped under their door. No return address. No stamps. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 sentences. "You've lit a fire that must be put out. Leave now, or you won't have another chance." Yusuf's hands trembled as he read it. Miriam hugged Alia tighter. Karim checked every lock on every window. Leonard picked up the note and stared at it. "They're getting desperate," he said. "That means we're closer than we think." But closer to what? Victory? Or something far more dangerous? The threat in the envelope changed the air inside the apartment. It no longer felt like a home, it felt like a target. The windows stayed closed. The lights remained dim. Everyone spoke in whispers, even though no one was listening from the walls. Or so they hoped. Karim sat by the door most nights, half awake, clutching a metal rod he kept near the shoe rack. Yusuf barely slept at all. His job was gone. His reputation, shredded in public. Strangers now crossed the street when they saw him. The city he once tried to call home had turned cold. Leonard stayed, despite the risks. His face was now on several online forums, labeled everything from traitor to apostate. He had received anonymous calls telling him to leave the country, warning him that he'd destroyed decades of theological authority in a single moment. But Leonard didn't care. He had already lost his old life. Now, he had only one duty left, to protect the girl who had opened his eyes. Alia, meanwhile, remained the still center of the storm. She continued her quiet routines, reading with her mother, drawing stars in her notebook, whispering prayers at night. But even her innocence carried the weight of a world watching. Every knock at the door made her mother flinch. Every car that slowed outside sent her father to the window. And yet the silence didn't last. Within days, an official letter arrived, this one not from anonymous hands, but from the government. It summoned the family to a formal immigration review hearing. The wording was civil, but the meaning was unmistakable. Your presence here is under question. Your future here is no longer certain. The date was set. 7 days from now. News of the hearing leaked within hours. Marcus Helsdorf moved swiftly. He called a new press conference, declaring the hearing a matter of national integrity. This is not about religion, he said. This is about structure, about safeguarding society from foreign manipulation. We must be vigilant. We must ask, who trained her? Who sent her here? What is the real agenda? The words hit their mark. Online hate surged again. Aliyah's name was trending for the wrong reasons. Cartoons mocked her. Commentators called her a puppet. Threats filled the inboxes of anyone who had defended her, including Leonard. But something else happened too, something Marcus didn't expect. Resistance. Across the country, a quiet uprising began to form, not with violence or protests, but with unity. Religious leaders from various backgrounds, Christian, Jewish, agnostic, and even atheists, began signing an open letter. It read, "The strength of our society is not in silencing innocence but in protecting it. We do not always have to agree on doctrine, but we must agree on decency. Let the girl be heard. Let the truth stand on its own." The letter went viral. Support came from unexpected places, a group of retired soldiers, a collective of school teachers, a group of former debate opponents of Father Leonard, even those who once clashed with him. They said, "If Leonard can change, maybe it's time we all listen." Still, the danger remained real. One evening, as Miriam walked home from a neighbor's house, a man on a motorcycle drove past and shouted, "Take your cult child and leave!" Later that night, their mailbox was torn off. Kareem began sleeping by the door full-time. Inside, Aliyah drew pictures of mountains and bridges. "Because mountains don't move," she told her mother. "But bridges help others reach them." The family needed more than bridges. They needed protection. So Leonard called an old friend, a lawyer named Elise Elbrin. Elise had attended the original debate as an observer. She had walked in as a non-believer, but she had walked out crying. Days later, she privately recited her declaration of faith, not because of pressure, but because of clarity. She had avoided the spotlight until now, but when Leonard called, she didn't hesitate. "I'll represent the family," she said. "But we have to do more than defend them. We have to defend the freedom to feel." She prepared the case overnight, documenting Yusuf's years of legal work and community contribution. She gathered statements from neighbors who once loved the family before fear changed their hearts. She even obtained surveillance footage showing Yusuf's shop being vandalized after the debate aired. The hearing would be tough, but she had a plan. The day before the hearing, the apartment was filled with nervous energy. Leonard sat near the window, staring at the street below. Yusuf paced quietly. Miriam prayed longer than usual. Kareem cleaned the kitchen, more out of anxiety than duty. Aliyah watched the sky. "They're going to ask us questions tomorrow," she said softly. Miriam nodded. "Yes." "What should I say?" Her mother hesitated. "You say whatever is in your heart." Aliyah nodded, then whispered, "Sometimes people don't want answers. They just want to stop the questions." That night, as the city slept, someone sprayed words and read across the wall outside their apartment. "One spark can burn down a country." Yusuf painted over it before sunrise. They couldn't afford more sparks. Finally, the day arrived. The courthouse was surrounded by media vans and flashing cameras. Protesters on both sides gathered outside. Some held signs that said, "Keep our country safe." Others held ones that read, "Let her speak." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Elise sat beside the family. Leonard sat behind them, flanked by 2 other supporters. Marcus Helsdorf was there too, standing with the prosecution as an unofficial advisor. His face was calm. But his eyes held something colder than law, vindication. The judge, an older woman with a sharp voice and steady eyes, called the room to order. This is a hearing to determine whether the continued residence of the Yusuf family poses a threat to national integrity. Elise stood first. She presented documents, timelines, and personal testimonials. She spoke with clarity and passion, not appealing to emotion, but to fairness. This family has broken no law, she said. The only thing that separates them from others is that their child spoke truth in a place used to control. The prosecution countered with vague claims of ideological influence. They showed clips of Aliyah speaking. They labeled it rhetorical conditioning. They questioned how a 5-year-old could speak like that unless she was being used. Then, the judge asked the final question. Is the child present? Everyone turned. Aliyah stood, small and still. Would you like to say something? The judge asked. The room fell silent. Aliyah stepped forward, looked at the judge, and then at the audience. She didn't speak with grandeur. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, I wasn't trying to change anyone. I just said what I felt. If that's wrong, then maybe we're all just pretending. And then she turned back and walked to her seat. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then, a woman in the back whispered through tears, She's just a child. And suddenly, the case no longer felt like a debate. It felt like a confession, one the entire society was about to make. The silence that followed Aliyah's words stretched long enough to feel like a verdict. The courtroom remained frozen, not out of indecision, but out of reflection. The simplicity of what she said had left every complex argument hanging in midair. I wasn't trying to change anyone. I just said what I felt. If that's wrong, then maybe we're all just pretending. Her voice didn't shake. Her posture didn't falter. But something inside the room shifted. A few jurors lowered their eyes. The prosecution lawyer glanced nervously at his notes, as if unsure which page could possibly respond to a 5-year-old's clarity. Even the judge, a woman known for her stern detachment, leaned back in her chair and folded her hands as if allowing the words to sink deeper. Elise gave Aliyah a small, proud nod as she sat down again. Leonard looked away briefly, wiping something from the corner of his eye. Marcus Helsdorf, seated beside the prosecution team, clenched his jaw. To him, this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war for control. And he was losing. Not through arguments, but through something far more dangerous, empathy. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd stood behind barricades. Live coverage was being streamed on every major network. The world wasn't just watching, they were waiting. This wasn't a private hearing anymore. It had become a referendum on something much bigger, truth versus fear. The judge finally spoke. I have heard the arguments. I have reviewed the documents. I will take time to deliberate. With a sharp bang of the gavel, the session adjourned. As people slowly exited, whispers filled the hallway. Some reporters rushed to file instant updates. Others stood near Marcus, hoping to get a statement. But he waved them off and disappeared down a private stairwell. Inside a small room near the back of the courthouse, Aliyah sat between her parents. Miriam gently brushed her daughter's hair back and whispered, You were brave. I wasn't brave, Aliyah replied. I just didn't want to lie. Kareem, pacing near the door, turned toward Leonard. What do you think? Will the judge rule in our favor? Leonard didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, his hands clasped tightly. I think, he said finally, that we've already won something. Even if they send this family away, the world has seen something they can't forget. But that won't protect them, Yusuf said. Sympathy doesn't cancel orders. What if we're deported? What happens to Aliyah? No one had an answer. Not even Elise. That night, back at the apartment, the atmosphere was painfully still. They had returned to find a crowd outside, supporters mostly, holding candles, holding signs, standing in silent solidarity. But even light can cast shadows. Across the street, plainclothes agents lingered, pretending to be pedestrians. A drone hovered briefly overhead before zipping away. Leonard sat by the window, watching the tension play out in quiet gestures. The woman handing tissues to a crying girl, the man nervously shifting his sign, the teenage boy with earbuds mouthing a prayer. These people came for her, he murmured. Karim joined him. And some came to watch her fall. Yusuf stood by the door with his arms crossed. It's always like this. The truth divides. Inside, Aliyah sat alone in the hallway, her sketchbook on her lap. She was drawing again, this time a tree with roots stretching far beneath the earth and stars shining above its branches. Miriam walked over. Why a tree, my love? Because no one sees the roots, she whispered. But that's what keeps it alive when storms come. Miriam smiled, heart aching with pride and fear. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Everyone froze. Yusuf approached the door slowly. Who is it? A familiar voice answered. Elise. I have news. They let her in quickly, locking the door behind her. The judge has called for a final ruling. Tomorrow morning. So soon? Leonard asked. She said there's no more to debate. Elise paused before continuing. I've seen many cases like this, but never one like this. No matter the outcome. I want you to know, your daughter has already changed the world. Miriam's eyes welled up. But will that protect her? Elise didn't answer. That night Yusuf barely slept. He stood over his daughter as she slept, her small chest rising and falling softly beneath the blanket. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. Whatever happens tomorrow, he whispered, you were never wrong for telling the truth. At sunrise, the apartment was filled with quiet preparation. Aliyah wore a soft blue dress. Her mother tied her hair into 2 gentle braids. Yusuf shaved. Leonard borrowed a clean shirt from Karim. Elise arrived early, dressed in black, carrying a thick folder of documents, and beneath it, a letter Aliyah had written to the judge the night before. I want her to have this, Aliyah had said. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was larger than ever. A group of musicians played soft violin. An old woman passed out paper hearts with the words, "Let her stay." Teenagers wrote chalk messages on the sidewalk. Truth is not a crime. And once again, the world watched. Inside the courtroom, the judge appeared, papers in hand. Yusuf held Miriam's hand. Miriam held Aliyah's. Leonard closed his eyes. Elise stood, ready. This court, the judge began, has reviewed all available evidence, including legal documentation, witness statements, and behavioral assessments. She paused. In addition, I have read the personal letter written by the child at the center of this hearing. I found it disarming. She turned to Aliyah. In your words, you asked me not to protect you, but to protect the light that you said lives in all of us. The room remained silent. Based on the law, this court finds no legal basis to deport this family. Their record is clean. Their presence is lawful. And their character, as witnessed by the public, is of no threat, only of challenge. She raised her eyes to the room. Challenge in the right hands is not a threat. It is progress. And then, this family is hereby granted permanent residency and full protection under the law. There was no explosion of applause. Just the sound of breath returning to lungs, of relief escaping through trembling lips. Miriam began to cry. Yusuf lowered his head, whispering thanks he could barely speak. Karim grinned, wiping away tears with the back of his hand. Leonard looked upward, lips barely moving, but his heart roaring. And Aliyah simply smiled. Outside, the crowd began to cheer, not because they had won something, but because something had been preserved. A child's voice. A family's dignity. A truth that could no longer be crushed by suspicion or fear. But even as peace returned for a moment, Marcus Helsdorf stood in a shadowed hallway of the courthouse, watching everything. He didn't speak. But his eyes said one thing clearly. This isn't over. The ruling should have ended everything. Legally, Aaliyah's family was now protected. The court had spoken. The government had no grounds to deport them. Supporters outside the courthouse celebrated with tears, prayers, and songs. Social media erupted with messages of hope. Some called it a victory for freedom of conscience. Others called it the triumph of innocence over intimidation. But the truth was more complex. Because while legal systems had declared peace, hearts and agendas had not. That same night, Marcus Helsdorf returned to his private residence. The ruling had hit him like a personal betrayal. The campaign he had so carefully constructed, the press manipulation, the fear-based narrative, the quiet legal pressure, had collapsed in front of a quiet 5-year-old girl who didn't even speak half the time. His advisors tried to offer alternatives. We can appeal. We can shift focus to broader immigration policies. We can wait for the next misstep. But Marcus wasn't interested in patience. He wasn't interested in strategy anymore. He wanted the story erased. The problem isn't the law, he growled, standing at the edge of his balcony, staring at the city lights. The problem is that too many people still believe in the story. He turned to his team. Then we killed the story. The next morning, Aaliyah's family was visited by 2 unexpected individuals, journalists from a prestigious international outlet. Their approach was unlike others. They didn't push microphones into faces. They didn't ask about scandals. Instead, they asked about light, about faith, about the moment in the church that changed everything. We're not here for headlines, one of them said. We're here to understand what happened to us when we saw that moment. Leonard agreed to speak on camera. So did Elise. Eventually, even Yusuf gave a short interview. But when it came time to speak with Aaliyah, her mother hesitated. She's just a child, Miriam said softly. She's more than that, the journalist replied. And the world already knows. They agreed, but only if the interview would be recorded in their home, on their terms. That evening, the world watched again as Aaliyah sat on her prayer mat, answering questions in her quiet, luminous way. Were you afraid that day? The journalist asked. Aaliyah nodded. A little. Then why did you still go up to speak? Because I felt the door open. And I thought, if I wait too long, it might close again. What do you want people to remember about you? Aaliyah looked straight into the camera. Nothing about me. I want them to remember what they felt when they stopped thinking for a moment, and started listening. The clip went viral across platforms in over 30 languages. But with the light came shadows. That very night, Yusuf's car tires were slashed outside their building. The word liar was carved into the side of the vehicle. Miriam received a message from an unknown number. The court can't protect you forever. Kareem found a flyer under their door warning. The next protest will be at your home. Leonard made a decision. I'm taking them away for a while, he told Elise. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere safe. Kareem nodded. I'll stay behind and monitor everything. We'll keep people distracted. But what about the media attention? Yusuf asked. Leonard smiled faintly. Let them chase smoke. Truth is not where the cameras are. It's where the hearts go. That night, the family packed only what they needed. No one knew where they were going, not even their closest allies. Elise arranged a private car. Leonard drove. They left under cover of night. The destination, a monastery tucked deep in the countryside, surrounded by hills and silent fields. It belonged to an old friend of Leonard's. A man who once studied theology but chose a life of farming and prayer. No internet. No phones. Just sky and soil. I figured, Leonard said as they arrived. If anything can help a heart recover, it's silence. And silence is what they found. For the first few days, they simply breathed. Yusuf tended to the garden. Miriam helped in the kitchen. Leonard repaired broken furniture in the chapel. And Aliyah wandered through the fields, collecting wild flowers and watching the stars. They lived quietly, without fear. And for a while, it felt like healing. Until a package arrived. There was no return address. Just a box left on the doorstep of the monastery. Inside it was a collection of photographs, zoomed-in pictures of Yusuf in the garden, Miriam hanging laundry, Aliyah kneeling in the grass, Leonard standing in the chapel window. And one note. "We know where you are. And others will too." Leonard stared at the photos for a long time. Then he burned them in the fireplace. "They won't stop," Yusuf said, voice shaking with anger. "No," Leonard replied. "Because truth doesn't just frighten the guilty, it terrifies those who've built empires on silence." The next morning, Leonard made a call. Elise answered. "They found us," he said. "It's time to go back." "You're sure?" she asked. "Yes. We didn't come this far to hide." News of their return leaked within hours. By evening, protesters and supporters had both gathered outside the courthouse where it all began. Rumors swirled. That Aliyah was going to be taken. That Leonard was going to be tried for blasphemy. That the government had reversed its ruling. None of it was true. But Marcus made sure the chaos stayed alive. He released a statement. "The reappearance of this family, after weeks in hiding, proves one thing: there are forces behind them. Coordinated. Dangerous. We demand a public inquiry." His supporters chanted outside the city hall. But something unexpected happened again. People showed up. Not to chant. Not to fight. But to stand, side by side in silence. Teachers. Artists. Former skeptics. Women in headscarves. Men in yarmulkes. Grandparents with children on their shoulders. They carried no signs. They shouted no slogans. They simply lit candles. Thousands of them. All around the city square. And Aliyah walked through them quietly, holding her mother's hand. The light from the candles reflected in her eyes. She whispered, "It's not about what they're afraid of. It's about what they've forgotten." Leonard, walking behind her, said softly, "And what's that?" "That love is stronger than fear. If you stop feeding the fear, it dies. But love grows even in silence." Miriam turned to her daughter. "And if they don't listen?" Aliyah smiled. "Then I'll keep whispering." The Dar al-Salam Islamic Center had always been a sanctuary. Nestled in a calm Illinois suburb, it stood with grace, its pale dome framed by oaks, its tall minarets rising quietly into the American sky. For the local Muslim community, it was more than just a house of worship. It was a heartbeat, a rhythm, a refuge. And every Thursday night, it came alive in a way no one outside the community could truly understand. Thursday evenings were special. After the final prayer of the night, known as the night prayer, dozens of families would gather in the courtyard. Children laughed under the lights strung above, women arranged chairs and poured tea, and a group of young men would begin their weekly devotional performance. The sound of tambourines filled the air, soft at first, then building with rhythm and power. Voices rose together, singing praises for the Prophet of Islam. The songs were traditional, heartfelt, and filled with poetic love. It had become a tradition passed down from generation to generation, an artistic way to spread faith through emotion, sound, and harmony. At the center of it all stood Joko Rahman, known to most simply as Mas Joko. A 34-year-old schoolteacher by day, he had become the soul of Thursday nights. He didn't have a commanding voice or stage presence. But when he sang, people listened. His humility was magnetic. His devotion undeniable. On this particular Thursday, as Joko adjusted the leather strap of his tambourine, he felt something different. A cold breeze slipped through the courtyard, even though the night was clear. He noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside the gates. Dark-tinted windows. No stickers. Not a familiar face in the driver's seat. Still, he began to sing. "May peace and blessings be upon the messenger," he chanted, tapping a soft rhythm. The crowd followed. The tambourines joined in. The melody rose into the night like it always did. Then, he walked in. A man in his mid-40s stepped through the side gate. Tall. Thick beard. Dressed in a traditional tunic and loose pants, both clean, both stiff. His walk was measured. His face was unreadable. Joko paused only slightly before continuing the chant. The man didn't join in. He didn't smile. He walked straight into the middle of the circle of tambourine players, then raised his voice without warning. "Stop this," he said. The crowd froze. The tambourines fell silent, the air heavy. "Do you even realize what you're doing?" he continued. "This is not the way to worship the Creator. This is imitation. This is falsehood. This is deviation." Joko slowly lowered his tambourine. The children stared wide-eyed. Several elders shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Excuse me," Joko said, choosing his words carefully. "This is how our community has been expressing faith for decades. Through these songs, many young people come closer to the mosque. It's a way of sharing." The man cut him off. "You think the Creator needs entertainment? You think banging drums and chanting poetry pleases the Almighty? This is foolishness. These are the actions of those who have lost their way." His voice was sharp. Angry. Final. A woman in the back gently pulled her daughter closer. An older man stood up but said nothing. Tension thickened like fog. Then, a voice emerged from the side. Calm. Firm. It was the chairman of the mosque, Mr. Somad, a respected elder with silver hair and a history of holding the community together. "Sir," he said with quiet dignity, "in this place, traditions like these have helped generations stay connected to faith. These songs, these gatherings, they are not entertainment. They are invitations. The early teachers of our faith in this land, they used music, poetry, culture, to reach hearts. This is not deviation. This is devotion in a form that touches souls." The visitor's eyes narrowed. "You dare use the names of past scholars to justify these rituals? Do you even understand what you're supporting? Prayer for the dead, group chants, offerings of food, these are not parts of original faith. They are corruptions, influenced by non-believers. You've turned worship into performance. This center should be a fortress of purity, not a playground of confusion." People began murmuring, some shaking their heads, others nodding faintly in fear or agreement. Children clung to their parents. The man's name was Ustaz Ridwan. He had moved to the area from another city just 3 months ago. No one knew much about him except that he was strict, serious, and deeply unyielding in his interpretations. Since his arrival, the community had started to change. Conversations became cautious. Smiles became shorter. And now, this confrontation in the heart of a beloved tradition felt like a warning of what was coming. Every Thursday after that night became colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. Ustaz Ridwan continued to attend the mosque, but always with criticism. He began forming his own study circle, only inviting certain men, mostly younger, impressionable attendees. He called it a revival group, focused on returning to the foundations of faith. But in truth, it became a camp of judgment. Every action outside their framework was condemned. Every tradition, no matter how old or beloved, was labeled a threat to true belief. The mosque, once filled with laughter and warmth, started to echo with silence. Attendance on Thursday nights dropped. Joko's group still gathered, but the tambourines didn't sound as strong. Something invisible was breaking. Then, something visible broke. One cold morning, Mr. Somad rushed to the home of the community's most respected figure, Mr. Hazim, a 70-year-old spiritual leader known for his wisdom and kindness. His breath was short, his hands trembling. The well behind the mosque," he said. "What about it?" Hazim asked, setting down his cup of black coffee. "It's dry." There was silence. "That well has never run dry," Hazim whispered. The well had stood since before the mosque existed, left behind by the school that once occupied the land. It had never run dry, not even once. Not even during the drought years. "I went to fetch water for ablution today," Somad explained. "But the bucket came up with only dust and sand." News of the dried-up well spread like fire. By noon, everyone in the neighborhood knew. Mothers whispered it at the market. Teens texted it to each other. In homes and shops, the same question rang: how could a sacred source of water just vanish? And under those whispers, louder suspicion grew. "It's him," muttered one elder at the coffee shop. "Since that man arrived, everything's been different," another added. "The traditions that protected this place, he called them heresy. Now even the earth seems to reject us." By nightfall, unease gripped the community. The center that once unified everyone had become a battlefield of belief. What began as a difference of opinion had become a spiritual standoff. And no one, not even Mr. Hazim, could have predicted that this was only the beginning. Because beneath that very mosque, below the cracked earth of that now dry well, was something buried. Something that would change everything. Friday morning began with a stillness that was unnatural for the Dar al-Salam Islamic Center. Usually, the mosque grounds would hum softly with life. Volunteers sweeping the courtyard, children chasing birds near the fountain, elders greeting one another with warm smiles. But today, the gates remained half-closed. The main prayer hall was quiet. Only the wind moved, stirring leaves across the dry, cracked stone that once led to the sacred well. Mr. Hazim stood alone near the edge of the well, staring into the dry mouth of what was once the community's most precious resource. His thoughts were loud even though the world around him had fallen quiet. This wasn't just about water. This was about something deeper, something symbolic. The well had never dried before. Not during power outages. Not during freezing winters. Not even during the great drought 5 years earlier when city water had to be rationed and tanker trucks delivered barrels to suburban homes. Through it all, the mosque's well remained steady. Steady and almost sacred. And now, nothing. A few feet behind him, Mr. Somad spoke quietly to 2 mosque board members, his face grim. "The city says there's no problem with groundwater in this area. Other properties nearby aren't affected. It's just us." The others exchanged looks. "Maybe we need to test the soil," one of them said. "There might be a sinkhole forming underneath." But it wasn't geology that haunted Mr. Hazim. "It's not a sinkhole," he said, almost to himself. It was as if something had been drained from beneath them, not water, but protection. Barakah. Blessing. By noon, word of the well had spread across the wider community. Youth volunteers who had once lined up to refill water tanks for ablution now stood idly, unsure of what to do. The weekly children's Qur'an class was cancelled. Women preparing meals in the community kitchen left early. Even Joko, the tambourine leader, sat silently on the mosque steps, staring at his instrument as if it were a relic from a different world. And in the midst of it all, Ustaz Ridwan was nowhere to be seen. When questioned, one of his young followers replied stiffly, "The teacher will not engage with those who persist in corrupt traditions. He's at home preparing new materials for his group's studies." To some, that confirmed everything. In the local cafe, whispers turned sharper. "This is divine punishment," said an older man, tapping his cane against the tile. "We allowed someone into our house who disrespected the soul of this community. This is what we get." "Maybe the songs were the only thing keeping this place alive," muttered another. "Maybe the tambourines were more than just noise." Back at the mosque, Mr. Hazim finally gathered the board members for a decision. "We have to do something," he said. "If we wait too long, this place will fall apart." "What do you suggest?" asked Somad. Hazim paused, then pointed toward the back of the property. "There's an old sapodilla tree," he said, "just beyond the east boundary wall. My grandfather used to say there was once a spring under that ground, long before this mosque was built. Maybe that's where the water wants to return." One board member looked doubtful. "The soil back there is hard as stone. Nothing grows well there except that one stubborn tree." "That may be so," Hazim replied, "but sometimes blessings are hidden in the hardest places." After a short but tense deliberation, it was agreed. The next morning, the community would dig. And they would dig together. Saturday dawned cool and gray. Clouds hung low like they were watching. Despite the chill, more than 40 men from the community arrived with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. The women came too, setting up a small cooking tent, ready to make tea, snacks, and warm meals for the workers. For the first time in weeks, something that resembled unity stirred in the air. Mr. Darman, the village council representative, took charge of organizing the work groups. "We'll begin at the marked site behind the sapodilla tree," he announced. "We'll dig 3 meters down. If there's no sign of water, we'll consult the city for deeper drilling." But beneath his official tone, everyone knew what they really hoped for. Not just water, but a sign. At exactly 9 a.m., a circle was drawn in the dirt, and digging began. Shovels struck ground with purpose. The clang of metal against packed earth echoed in rhythm. Joko joined the first line of diggers, sweat beading on his forehead within minutes. His arms were sore, but he didn't stop. Neither did the high schoolers. Or the elderly man with the limp. Everyone, even those who had not spoken to each other in days, found purpose in the dirt. At 9:47 a.m., someone unexpected appeared. A black car parked beside the main gate. The door opened, and out stepped Ustaz Ridwan. He was alone, holding a shovel. He walked slowly, hesitantly, toward the group. Joko saw him first. His grip on the shovel tightened, then loosened. He glanced at Mr. Hazim, who simply nodded. Ustaz Ridwan approached quietly and spoke in a low tone. "I may not agree with all of you," he said, "but the mosque belongs to all of us. If there's no water, it affects everyone. I'm here to help." And with that, he stepped to the far edge of the circle and began to dig. No one said anything. But no one stopped him either. At exactly 10:52 a.m., Mas Joko's shovel hit something strange. It wasn't rock. It was soft but dense. And it made a dull thud. He called over Mr. Hazim, who immediately crouched down and ran his fingers through the disturbed soil. The texture was different. The color was darker. More brittle. "Dig slower," Hazim instructed. With surgical care, they dug by hand, removing small sections at a time. Then it appeared. A bone. Maybe a root, someone said. Maybe a tree branch. But it wasn't. It was smooth. Curved. Too clean to be anything but human. Seconds later, another bone emerged. Then a third. A hand rose to Joko's mouth. His eyes widened as he stepped back. More people gathered. The hole now revealed not just bones, but a skull. Then another. Panic rippled through the crowd. Some gasped. Some stumbled back in fear. One man dropped his shovel and sprinted to the outer wall, vomiting. Ustaz Ridwan, who had been digging a few feet away, stepped closer, his face pale. "What is this?" he whispered. No one answered. Then came the voice of Mr. Hazim. "Stop digging," he said. "Cover the area with tarps. And call the police." By noon, yellow tape encircled the site. An entire section of the mosque's backyard was roped off. Flashing lights arrived minutes later. 2 black and white police cars, 1 forensic van, and several federal agents in dark uniforms. Dar al-Salam was no longer just a mosque. It was a crime scene. A crime buried in silence. A silence that had waited decades to be uncovered. The sound of shovels had stopped. In their place came the buzz of radios, the snapping of gloves, and the heavy silence of shock. Police cars idled near the mosque gates, red and blue lights flashing over the courtyard walls like slow, pulsing heartbeats. Officers stood just beyond the yellow caution tape, hands on hips, speaking in quiet tones to one another. Inside the taped perimeter, the digging team had been replaced by professionals, gloved, masked, and methodical. Residents who had gathered to dig now stood motionless behind the barriers, faces stricken, whispering questions that had no answers. Are they really human? Is it just one body? What happened here? The question wasn't just about bones. It was about history. Identity. Trust. A detective, Officer Hannah Royce, stepped forward. She was young, but her calm demeanor carried weight. She approached the gathered elders with a measured tone. We've confirmed the remains are human. At least 6 sets of bones have been found so far, all in various states of decay. We will be conducting a full forensic excavation over the next few days. In the meantime, the area is considered a sealed investigation site. Mr. Haziem's jaw tightened, but he nodded respectfully. Will you need to close the entire mosque? Royce glanced over her shoulder at her team, then shook her head. Only the back area for now. You may continue prayers inside. But I advise against any gatherings near the excavation site. Mr. Somad stepped forward, clearly distressed. Detective, this place is sacred to us. That land, where you're digging, it's behind our mosque, yes. But for decades it has been part of our spiritual ground. How could this happen here? Royce hesitated, then replied honestly. That's what we're going to find out. By evening, news had spread beyond the local community. The headline appeared quietly online first. Human remains found on religious site in suburban Illinois. Within hours, larger news outlets caught wind of it. Reporters circled the gates by sundown. A camera drone hovered briefly before being asked to leave. The mosque board refused to give statements. But speculation had already begun. Was this a crime scene from long ago? Was it related to historical events? Was the mosque covering something up? The residents of Dar al-Salam weren't just confused now, they were afraid. Joko sat in his car across the street, tambourine resting in the passenger seat, untouched. He hadn't said a word since he discovered the first bone. He replayed the moment over and over, the strange resistance under his shovel, the eerie feel of the soil, the unmistakable curve of a human skull. In a community rooted in peace, how had something so violent ended up right beneath their feet? That night, Ustaz Ridwan sat in his small apartment, alone. He had come to the village to purify what he believed was a misguided community. He had delivered sermons against what he saw as innovation, superstition, and compromise. And now he found himself staring at a news report about a mass grave under the very mosque he had called corrupt. He felt like the air had thickened around him. Not long ago, he had declared that the mosque had lost its path. Now the ground itself was unearthing secrets. He had spent most of his life studying religious texts. He could debate with clarity. He could quote with precision. But this was different. This wasn't about laws or rituals. This was about something haunting. Human. Broken. He closed his laptop slowly, hands trembling. He didn't know why, but a sudden image flashed in his mind, children singing songs of devotion, the beat of tambourines in the night, voices layered with joy and longing. He had once condemned them as misguided. Now he wasn't so sure. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Mr. Haziem. The next morning, the forensic team resumed their work at dawn. A tent had been erected over the dig site. White plastic sheets covered exposed areas. Spotlights had been mounted. It looked like a battlefield of truth. Joko, despite the nightmares from the night before, returned. He stood behind the tape, watching the scene unfold, arms crossed. He hadn't touched his tambourine since the discovery. It now sat beneath his bed like a silenced voice. A local historian, Professor Matthew Clark, arrived mid-morning with 2 assistants. He had been contacted by the police to consult on possible historical connections. He knelt beside one of the forensics experts and whispered something. Then he turned to the officers and pointed. "That pattern of burial, haphazard, shallow, overlapping bodies, it's common in conflict-related mass graves. Wartime, political purges, rebel suppression. It looks rushed. Panicked." Detective Royce asked. "Any time period come to mind?" Clark rubbed his chin. "Impossible to be exact without carbon dating. But I'd wager we're looking at somewhere between 50 to 60 years ago. Possibly mid-1960s. That name, the 1960s, hung heavy in the air. To the older members of the mosque, it meant something. But it was Mr. Hazim who finally stepped forward and spoke. Quiet. Measured. Like someone releasing a truth he had buried long ago. "My father told me once," he said, "about a school that used to exist here before this mosque was built. A religious boarding school. It wasn't big, but it was full of life. They taught young people how to share their faith through art, music, poetry, and community theater." Royce nodded slowly. "Go on." "One night," Hazim continued, "a group of armed men came. No one knows who they were. Some said they were military. Others said they were vigilantes. But they accused the teachers of spreading foreign ideologies. They claimed the school was protecting enemies of the state. The next morning, the school was gone. Burned to the ground." Professor Clark leaned in, interested. "And the students?" "No one ever found them," Hazim said. "We assumed they had fled. But maybe they never left." The tent fell silent. Even the forensic officers paused in their movements. Royce looked at Hazim carefully. "You believe these remains are from that night?" "I believe," he said slowly. "We've just uncovered a graveyard built on misunderstanding." By evening, another item was discovered. Not a bone. Not a weapon. But something almost more powerful. A small leather-bound journal, wrapped in cloth, buried near the lower edge of the grave site. Its pages were stained, but intact. And the first line, written in perfect ink, read, "Tonight we sang with joy. 3 families accepted our invitation to faith. The tambourine was loud. The hearts were louder." The journal was unlike anything the forensic team had expected to find. Weathered yet remarkably preserved, its pages offer not just documentation, but testimony. A voice from the past, buried in silence and now speaking through dust. Detective Royce handled it with latex-gloved hands. Each word, each line, was being photographed, scanned, and catalogued for evidence. But for the elder standing just beyond the yellow tape, the journal wasn't evidence, it was memory. Mr. Hazim had not yet touched the book, though he was staring at it as if it were calling to him. The historian, Professor Clark, leaned over Royce's shoulder and read a few more lines. "We were warned not to play the tambourine tonight. A stranger came and told us music would only bring death. But how can you silence joy when hearts are being guided? Tonight we sang anyway." Royce turned a page. "Qiyai Mansur told us not to fear. That truth would protect us. That faith spread through love would never die." She looked at Hazim. "Does the name Qiyai Mansur mean anything to you?" Hazim nodded slowly. "He was the head teacher of the old school. My father said he was kind. He taught that love for God could be shared through art, through celebration, through community. Not just rules and sermons. But he disappeared the night the school was destroyed," Professor Clark added. That fits. If this is his student's journal, we now have written proof that the school was violently shut down. And more importantly, that these bodies may be the teachers and students of that institution. Silence fell again. But it was not empty silence. It was dense, with memory, with sorrow, and with growing realization. Inside the prayer hall, the atmosphere had shifted. Though technically untouched by the crime scene, the main area of worship now felt colder. The ornate prayer rugs, once symbols of unity, lay untouched. The microphone at the front sat unused. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Joko sat cross-legged in the corner, staring at his tambourine lying in front of him. It had always brought him peace. But now, he didn't know what to feel. Was he still holding a musical instrument? Or had it become an echo of a deeper truth? He was joined by someone he didn't expect, Ustaz Ridwan. Without a word, Ridwan sat beside him, his expression softer than it had ever been. For a few seconds neither man said anything. Then Ridwan spoke. "I saw it," he said. "The journal." Joko didn't look up. Ridwan continued. "The songs. The tambourine. The gatherings. It was never about entertainment for them either, was it?" Joko turned slowly. "It never was for us either. But you told everyone it was a deviation. That it was a path to destruction." "I was wrong," Ridwan whispered. Joko blinked in surprise. "I came here believing there was only one correct way to worship," Ridwan said. "One way to walk the path. And I mistook your way for misguidance because I didn't understand its history." He pointed toward the back of the mosque, where the yellow tape still fluttered in the wind. "But now we know that their way of teaching, their way of spreading belief, it cost them their lives. And we buried them. Not just in soil, but in shame. In silence." Joko stared at his tambourine. "They died for it." Ridwan looked at him. "Which means it was worth dying for." Meanwhile, outside under the forensic tent, another artifact had been discovered. A tambourine. Not new. Not factory-made. It was hand-carved, the leather taut over a cracked wooden frame. Faded markings adorned the side, small floral designs and the name, Arif, etched carefully into the rim. Professor Clark examined it closely. "It's not just a musical instrument. It's a personal item. Likely belonged to one of the students." Detective Royce placed the tambourine beside the journal, on a black velvet display pad the team had set up. She stared at the two items, side by side, one echoing joy, the other echoing grief. And she whispered almost to herself. They weren't rebels. They were artists. The police investigation continued for the rest of the week. In total, 22 sets of remains were recovered, each buried hastily, some tangled with others. Clothing scraps were found, modest garments consistent with religious boarding schools. A few sets of wooden prayer beads. A silver pendant with a crescent moon. And finally, a singed textbook titled, Teaching Through Compassion. The evidence painted a story clearer than any rumor or memory could have ever managed. And now the world knew. The media returned in full force. Headlines shifted. Mass grave confirmed behind Illinois mosque, tied to 1960s religious suppression. Faith, not firearms, community reflects on a tragedy forgotten. Tambourines and tears, how joy was silenced then found again. On the 8th day since the discovery, a public gathering was held. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a memorial, at least not officially. But people came. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. Muslim and non-Muslim. Journalists, professors, religious leaders, local politicians. The story had struck a nerve in communities across the country. A makeshift wooden podium had been placed outside the mosque entrance. Mr. Hazim stepped up slowly, supported by Joko on one side and Somad on the other. His voice was calm. Measured. For over 50 years, he said. The land behind this mosque hid a tragedy. But today, that land has become sacred once more, not because of what was buried, but because of what we've unearthed, the truth. He paused. We live in a time where division is often mistaken for faith, where shouting is mistaken for strength. But the people we buried did not shout. They sang. And they paid for their songs with their lives. Then, to the crowd's surprise, he stepped back and gestured for someone else to come forward. Ustaz Ridwan. The man who had once condemned the songs now stood at the podium. His eyes were red. His voice cracked. I arrived in this town thinking I had all the answers, he said. But I never asked the questions that mattered. Who were these people? Why did they sing? What was it that they tried to preserve? He looked out over the crowd. Now I know. They sang to preserve hope, to teach faith through gentleness, to preach love instead of fear. He took a deep breath. To the people I hurt with my words, I ask for your forgiveness. Joko stepped forward, tambourine in hand. He held it out toward Ridwan. And to everyone's shock, Ridwan accepted it. With trembling hands he tapped it once, then twice. And then, slowly, a rhythm began. The tambourine echoed in a slow, measured rhythm, 3 soft beats that broke decades of silence. In the crowd, not a single person moved. Mothers clutched their children. Elders stood like statues. Joko, usually the leader of the devotional music group, stood beside Ustaz Ridwan, watching the transformation unfold not just in sound, but in spirit. It was more than a gesture. It was an apology in rhythm. An act of surrender. A request to listen to what had once been silenced. That night, after the crowd had dispersed and the media vans had rolled away, the core members of the mosque community gathered in the main prayer hall. It was late. The sky outside was pitch black. But inside, a soft, golden light filled the space from the hanging lanterns overhead. On the center table lay the item that had stirred them all to the core, the recovered journal. Detective Royce had returned it to the mosque earlier that day with permission from the forensic unit. Scanned, recorded, photographed, but now physically returned to its rightful guardians. She had said, "This isn't just evidence. It's heritage. Protect it." And so they would. Mr. Hazim, seated with his back straight and his fingers gently brushing the journal's edge, opened it slowly. The cover creaked, the leather worn but strong. The first page still bore that opening line. "Tonight we sang with joy." He began to read aloud. April 4th, 1965. We gathered again tonight after the evening prayer. Qiyai Mansur spoke about mercy. He told us that mercy was the strongest form of resistance. We practiced the devotional songs under the neem tree. I think I'm getting better at keeping rhythm. My tambourine no longer sounds like a frightened duck. Arif, age 17. The room chuckled quietly at that last line. Even in tragedy, humor lived. Joko whispered, "They were just kids." Hazim turned the page. April 17th, 1965. The guest who arrived yesterday looked uncomfortable. He frowned when we sang. He said we were wasting time. He warned us that music would bring danger. Qiyai Mansur listened calmly, then invited him to sit and join us. The guest left before the tea was served. We didn't see him again. Arif. Ustaz Ridwan lowered his head. Hazim paused, sensing the tension, then continued. May 2nd, 1965. 3 families from the next village came today. One of them brought their teenage daughter. She cried during the devotional song. Later, she said she had never heard someone praise God with such gentleness. I wonder if that's what made her heart open. She asked for a tambourine to take home. A tear rolled down the cheek of one of the board members. The room was still, save for the sound of breathing and the pages turning. June 1st, 1965. Rumors are spreading. Someone says that our school is a hiding place for rebels. That our teachers speak of justice too often. That our music is coded protest. But all we've ever sung about is love for the Creator, the Prophet, and the world. If that's rebellion, then the world has gone mad. Ustaz Ridwan leaned forward slightly, unable to take his eyes off the journal. Joko handed him the next page. June 11, 1965. We buried a box of song lyrics behind the big sapodilla tree. We think they might try to silence us soon. But we want someone to find our words one day. Someone who understands. If you're reading this, we were never trying to divide anyone. We were just trying to reach hearts. A hush fell over the group. Some wept openly. Others clasped their hands over their mouths, unable to speak. Ustaz Ridwan held the page in his hands like it was glass. These are the words I tried to destroy, he said quietly. And yet, they've survived me. Mr. Hazim looked at him gently. That is the grace of truth. It waits, even when it's buried. The following day, Ustaz Ridwan did not attend the mosque. Not because he was avoiding it, but because he needed space. He spent hours walking through the neighborhood surrounding Dar al-Salam. He observed the homes, the families, the teenagers laughing with earbuds in, the elderly watering their lawns. He passed by a local community center where a group of youth were playing drums as part of an interfaith art project. The beats reminded him of the ones he had once silenced. And now, they sounded holy. He returned home before dusk and took out an old box of study materials he hadn't touched in years. Among the books on theology, law, and scripture, he found a small notebook of his own. His first notes as a young teacher. Passionate. Exacting. Unforgiving. He stared at the line he had once written proudly at the top of the first page. Purity requires rejection. Below it, with a shaking hand, he added, but understanding requires listening. 2 nights later, he returned to the mosque. A small group had gathered again, this time not for digging, not for crisis, but for healing. Joko had brought the tambourine group together, uncertain if they should perform. Some of the youth were afraid. Others felt awkward. The instruments had started to feel like relics of trauma. But when Ridwan entered the prayer hall, carrying his own tambourine, borrowed from the mosque's historical display, the room fell into stunned silence. He didn't say much. Just this. I read the diary twice. And then a third time. I understood every law I ever memorized better after that. He looked at the group. If I may, I'd like to join tonight. Not to lead, but to follow. The young players nodded. And then, for the first time in over 5 decades, the song that had been buried with the students was played once again. Softly. Carefully. Each beat landed like a heartbeat echoing through time. Ridwan's hands trembled as he followed the rhythm. But he played. And his voice joined Joko's, no longer the voice of condemnation, but the voice of return. The morning of the reburial ceremony dawned under a golden sky. A soft fog hugged the trees surrounding the Dar al-Salam Islamic Center. The wind moved gently through the courtyard, stirring leaves across the brick paths where mourners now gathered. Long lines of folding chairs had been set up near the eastern boundary, just far enough from the original grave site to avoid disrupting it, but close enough for everyone to feel its sacred presence. 22 caskets stood in a row. Each one small. Plain. Dignified. Each holding the remains of someone who had been lost not just in death, but in memory. The newly designated burial site was behind the mosque, on land officially donated by the city after learning of the discovery. A waqf plot. Reserved for those the community now referred to as the Martyrs of Light, the forgotten students and teachers who had once used art and loved to guide others toward faith. Police officers stood respectfully at the edges. News cameras stayed at a distance. This wasn't a media event. It was a funeral. And a reckoning. Ustaz Ridwan stood at the side of the procession. His clothes were modest. His eyes swollen from sleepless nights. In one hand, he carried a folded piece of paper. In the other, a single white flower. Joko stood beside him, tambourine in hand, but silent for now. Mr. Hazim took the podium, a simple wooden stand placed beneath the old sapodilla tree. The tree now stood not as a marker of hidden pain, but as a sentinel of peace. Its thick branches spread over the ceremony like arms of protection. The elder began to speak. "Today is not about guilt," he said. "And it is not about blame. Today is about returning what was taken. About lifting from the earth what was buried not just in soil, but in shame." He turned to the caskets. "These people, our brothers, our sons, our teachers, were not rebels. They were artists, preachers, seekers. And today, we do not just bury their bones. We raise their voices." The crowd remained silent, but many wept quietly. Mothers clutched handkerchiefs. Young people bowed their heads, some holding copies of the recovered journal in their hands. Then Hazim stepped aside. And to everyone's surprise, Ustaz Ridwan stepped forward. He unfolded the piece of paper in his hand. His voice trembled as he began. "I came to this mosque to correct what I thought was a deviation. I thought I was on the path of truth. I judged. I criticized. I dismissed everything I did not understand." He paused. "But truth," he continued, "is not always found in volume, or in control. Sometimes it is found in rhythm, in melody, in tears." He looked out at the crowd, eyes glistening. "I was wrong. These people I condemned, they were doing what I failed to do. They were reaching hearts. They were teaching with beauty. I mistook gentleness for weakness. I mistook joy for corruption. And I am sorry." There was no applause. No response. Just silence. And then, a single tambourine tapped once. Joko stepped forward, lifted his instrument, and struck it again. Then once more. Then others joined in. A dozen tambourines. Then 20. A slow, measured beat, soft and respectful. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a celebration. It was a farewell. An offering of rhythm to accompany souls that had waited over 50 years to be remembered. As the caskets were lowered into the ground, one by one, the beat continued. Some people sang softly. Others whispered prayers. And when the last casket touched the earth, the beat stopped. The wind, too, seemed to pause. Over the next week, the burial site was landscaped with care. Volunteers built a low stone wall around the grave. A wooden bench was placed beneath the sapodilla tree. A plaque was installed with the names, those confirmed, and those unknown. But it was the monument that stood at the center which captured everyone's hearts. Not a statue. Not a fountain. But a large tambourine. Handcrafted. Carved from wood donated by the community. Its frame bore inscriptions taken directly from the recovered journal. "We sang because we loved. Music is not rebellion, it is return. Let those who listen know our hearts were pure." Beneath the instrument, another inscription read, "Dedicated to the 22 voices buried, now remembered. May rhythm always remind us that love never dies." Inside the mosque, change continued. The tambourine circle returned on Thursday nights, not as a reaction, but as a reclaiming. This time, it included young girls, elderly men, even skeptics who once called it distraction. They came now with reverence. Ustaz Ridwan, once their harshest critic, had become their guide, not in leading, but in protecting. He taught the children how to connect rhythm with meaning. He explained how every beat could become a form of worship when intention aligned with heart. One Thursday, he handed Joko a worn-out tambourine and said, "This was mine, from long ago. Before I forgot what sound meant. I want the kids to learn with it now." And the children did come. Where fear had once silenced them, now laughter rang again through the halls. The courtyard returned to life. The well, though never restored in the original spot, was replaced by a new one on the mosque's east side. To everyone's amazement, its water ran colder, clearer, and more abundant than anyone expected. "It's a sign," someone said. "It's a beginning," said Hazim. The well was named the Well of Return. 3 weeks after the reburial, the mosque held its first open house since the incident. Families from nearby churches, synagogues, and cultural centers attended. Muslim youth gave guided tours. Children performed a short song, a tribute written in memory of the journal's author, Arif. The tambourine rhythm underscored each verse like a heartbeat from the past. When it ended, applause rang through the mosque. And at the very back, where no one could see him clearly, stood a woman in her 70s. She wore a scarf and clutched something tightly in her hands. When the crowd parted slightly, she stepped forward and handed Mr. Hazim an old photograph. It showed a young boy, smiling shyly, holding a tambourine. Behind him, the sapodilla tree. "My brother," she whispered. "His name was Arif. You've honored him well." Hazim's hands trembled as he took the photo. He nodded silently. "No," he whispered back. "He honored all of us." The sun rose gently over the Dar al-Salam Islamic Center, casting long shadows across the grass and fresh flowers that now bordered the eastern yard. In the silence of dawn, the new well stood as a quiet symbol of rebirth. Cold, clear water gushed from its tap into the metal basin below. A young boy, no older than 9, filled a plastic jug while his sister watched, both of them laughing as the splash wet their shoes. The well had become a daily ritual. Not just for ablution, but for remembrance. For unity. For healing. Above it, mounted on a polished oak plaque, were words engraved in steel. "May this water never dry, like the brotherhood that flows from hearts united." It was a message that no one could misinterpret. A message that rose not from textbooks or theory, but from decades of buried truth finally brought into the light. Inside the mosque, a new kind of rhythm had taken hold. The Thursday devotional circle had grown. Now even non-Muslim guests often sat quietly along the walls, listening. The tambourines still beat, but they were gentler, measured. Children sang side by side with adults. Elders smiled, tears in their eyes, as they watched traditions once labeled wrong, now embraced as bridges between generations. In the center of it all stood a glass case. Inside it, illuminated softly by a golden lamp, was the ancient tambourine. The very one pulled from the earth, cracked and covered in decades of silence. Next to it, a preserved copy of Arif's journal. The case wasn't just a display, it was a shrine. A story in physical form. And every person who stood before it knew this was sacred ground. Ustaz Ridwan stood at the back of the prayer hall, arms folded, watching as the youth recited verses before the circle began. He no longer stood at the podium. No longer needed to. His teachings had changed. Not in content, but in tone. He now taught with stories. With patience. With acknowledgement of the many valid paths within the journey of faith. He once thought strength came from strictness. Now, he knew it came from listening. He once thought truth was narrow. Now he saw it as light, able to pass through any form, any culture, any soul willing to receive it. One Thursday, a young student approached him and asked, "Ustaz, how do we know if our way is right?" He had smiled gently and answered, "If it brings people closer to kindness, closer to truth, and doesn't break what God told us to protect, then it's a good way. Maybe not the only way, but a good one." The boy nodded, understanding more than words could explain. In the weeks that followed the reburial, a book was written. A local historian, moved by the story, compiled journal entries, eyewitness testimonies, and photographs into a short volume titled, "The Tambourine Beneath the Mosque, A Story of Faith Buried and Found." It quickly spread through university campuses and interfaith libraries. People across the country read about the massacre that had gone forgotten. About the music, the misunderstanding, the tragedy, and the healing. Some called it a story of justice. Others, a warning. But many called it a miracle. Requests came in for Ustaz Ridwan and Mr. Hazim to speak on panels, podcasts, and live discussions. At first, they declined. The wounds were too fresh. But eventually, Ridwan agreed to one televised interview. When asked what changed him the most, he paused, then said, "I thought faith was about rules. But it's actually about return. About remembering who we are, what we're meant to protect, and how easily our fear can make us forget the beauty in others." He paused. "And also, I read a journal. A teenage boy's journal. His words showed more wisdom than all the volumes I had memorized." Back in the mosque, Joko continued to lead the music circle. He had become a local legend, not just for uncovering the grave, but for holding his ground when judgment stormed in. But Joko didn't care for recognition. He only cared that the children were no longer afraid. That the tambourines no longer sat collecting dust. That the laughter had returned to the courtyard like birds returning to spring. One Thursday night, as practice ended and people began packing up, Joko found a small envelope on his tambourine. Inside was a folded piece of paper. "Dear Joko," it read. "My name is Sarah. I'm 12 years old. I just wanted to say I love how the songs make me feel. They help me when I feel scared. My mom says the beat sounds like a heartbeat. I think she's right." He smiled and looked up. Sarah was near the doorway, trying not to make eye contact. He waved. She waved back. Another voice restored. On the 60th day after the discovery, the mosque hosted a candlelight event, one last remembrance to close the chapter, while keeping its lessons alive. 22 candles were placed around the old grave site. Each was lit by someone different, a child, a mother, a scholar, a community member. One by one, they circled the small tombstones, each flame dancing softly in the night air. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Hazim, frail but determined, stepped forward one last time. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that when truth came, it would divide us further. But truth didn't divide us. It saved us." He turned to Ridwan. "I thank you," he said. "Not for changing, but for being willing to." Then he turned to the crowd. "May we all remember, when music brings people together, it is not noise, it is mercy. When remembrance brings tears, they are not weakness, they are water. And water, as we have seen, never stops flowing, when it comes from the right place." As the final candle was lit, a light wind swept through the yard. The tree above, the sapodilla tree, shivered gently. And in the distance, from the new well, water poured. Unbroken. Unending.